Well, I wasn't sure when we started this if we would make it till this night, but glad you all are here and glad you've been a part of this journey. This is going to be rapid fire tonight. It turned out when I went back to pull a slide or two from each week, it turned out to be a lot of slides. So we're going to go in a hurry, and the images hopefully will just reinforce things along the way, maybe things that we remember. I do have an announcement for those of you who have been following Ann Wright's situation. She passed this afternoon about 5 o'clock. So the service that was mentioned will go ahead as planned, I think, on that. All right. When we started this back in August, we introduced this slide to begin with. That this was the whole concept of midweek. We were sort of repackaging, rebranding this, and used Hill Street Blues as the sort of launching point as midweek blues, basically. Hill Street, of course, is the precinct where the blues officers were stationed. And at the end of each one of those encounters each week, this is what Sergeant always said as they were leaving: let's be careful out there. And that was kind of the beginning point of why we're even talking about this. What's going on out in the world that our children are exposed to? Why is it that we need to be attentive to it? What do we need to be doing in order not only to be careful in protecting them, but to be careful in how we teach them to take care of themselves when we're not a part of their world at the time. In full disclosure, the title actually came from the Crosby, Stills, Nash Young song from the late 1960s, Teach Your Children. And the message in the song was one verse aims at parents, the other at children, and how they will never be able to understand one another, and you just have to live with it and go on. I hope that we're going to understand each other better because we've had a chance to just talk about that. This slide was actually introduced fairly early to say why this is so important. And that is that, Satan is basically at work all the time, doing whatever he can do to frustrate God's plan. And the greatest opportunity to do that is to separate us from God in that relationship. So the operative word that night was, we and our children are collateral damage. He really does not care about what happens to us as long as he frustrates the plan that God has in place. So when we're teaching our children about this, it's very, very important to know that he is ruthless in whatever it takes to make sure that that happens. And then you've seen that picture several times. This is that aerial shot of Woodstock, where from my perspective in all of this discussion, this was the really memorable moment when everything began to unravel. Obviously, it had been going on for a long time before that, but it all came into place in August of 1969 when this gathering took place. And then we looked at what has changed since Woodstock. And there are other things that you could add to the list. We added COVID. I think we added some other things as we talked about it on the whiteboard. But these are major shifts in cultural attitudes toward what at one time were considered absolutes. So now we have this confusion over 50 years that we as parents are responsible for sorting out. And can you ever go back? Well, we can't go back unless we really work at it, trying to make things right again. This was the issue. If you remember, we looked at generational divides, the difference in attitude, the difference in thinking between one generation to the next. And we're not going to go back through that tonight, but I did want to put this graph up because this is reflective of the generational progression over that, if you followed that slide that just preceded this. And the idea was that 50 years ago, the Bible was basically the go-to resource for absolutes. It was the defining resource for any discussion. But you can see as time has progressed, that has fallen off in a steep decline and has been replaced by this attitude of, I will decide what's important. My worldview is as valid as any other worldview that's out there. And so now we add to this chaos of no underlying absolute, which is why we've had this big launch that Jordan has done such a good job with, trying to help us change the worldview again. How do we look at it in a way that we can talk about it with our children? This has been the foundational, the pivot, the hinge for everything that we've talked about. And that is trying to walk through Scripture to find those moments where God the Father, with Jesus his Son on earth, interacted in such a way that we get a glimpse of what God considered important in the life of his Son. Sort of fathering, not in close proximity on earth, but in connection, in relationship. And so the premise is that if God the Father is parent to Jesus the Son, and I think we would agree to that, and if we're created like God to be responsible for our children, then our best parenting model is going to come from whatever we can glean from the way that the Father and the Son interacted. So that's every week, we've tried to find one of those moments where we could connect. All right, we started here with the need to envision family. And you remember the text we looked at, this was in Luke. This was the announcement God sent via Gabriel to Mary to advise her what the plan was and to basically tell her that she was going to be the mother of his Son. Now, you remember her response was she was greatly troubled. And I think our discussion at that point was that's not terribly atypical. You know, that when we find that we're expecting children, that we're about to be parents, there is this wave of anxiety that comes over. Can we do this? Are we equipped to do this? Will we be able to manage this? And she listens as Gabriel lays out the plan, very bold, very specific. God is very into saying, this is what my Son will do, and he will make a difference. There was a vision that was created even before she was pregnant. So there's an emphasis here that comes that we should be thinking about that when our children are, even before they're in our arms. How are they going to make a difference in this world, and how are we going to help them make that difference? We talked about if we could gather up a group of advisors to tell us what we need to do. You remember we could ask Solomon, and basically he says, without a vision, people perish. We could ask Luke, and he would tell us what the Ethiopian eunuch said, that if somebody doesn't tell me about it, they're never going to figure it out. I'm never going to figure it out. Or we could ask Paul, and he could say, look, you can't believe if you haven't heard it. So it's loud and clear that the vision has to be conceived along with the child, and then it has to be spoken so that the child or our children understand what that vision may be. All right, that was the first one. And then we moved along. Some of these slides will maybe jog your memory about discussion. But we talked about celebrating life, and this was the announcement to the shepherds. As that discussion evolved that night, we were talking about how it's important that this timeline is established early on in the understanding of our children. That the union of egg and sperm is the beginning of life eternal. Okay, that I will never not be. Now, I will not be in this body forever, but I will always be going forward. That I may drop out of sight, but I don't drop out of eternity. That the choices that I make determine how I spend the forever part of my life. So investing in helping our children make good choices, figure out how to make good choices, what the absolutes are that help them make good choices, is critical to understanding this line. And then Jordan's here tonight, so I'm going to borrow this again. We put this up, this was early on in his presentation, about how we celebrate not only the life, every life, but how we celebrate the lives of others. And how basically it's a steep climb. And if you remember, we talked about, we start with God loves you, and that comes up multiple times in this. We keep coming back to this theme. That's where we start. And then you take the next step. Well, because God values me, then I should love myself. I'm not damaged goods, okay? I can love myself. And then if I can love myself, God values every person, okay? So I can love everybody like he loves me and like I love me. And then this is where we stall out. This is where we get stuck on the mountain. Because trying to teach, okay, how do I love others more than myself? And even worse than that, we get real short-winded at the height when we talk about love your enemies. So celebrating life isn't just life in the womb. It's celebration of life in general, all lives. And moving up the mountain, we have to start early. And then we have to demonstrate how we climb so that they climb along with us. So, and then this was the summary slide. I'm going to try to drop these in pretty often tonight. That if we can teach that our kids are valuable because God values them, that they can be unique contributors to helping other folks follow behind, that they will live forever. That's a concept that's hard to get out there, but we need to figure out how to do that. That their choices are going to determine their destination, and that they should value others because God desires no one be lost. Then we have taught them well to celebrate life. Okay? And then we moved on, and we talked about protecting innocence. And this scripture connection was the message that comes to Joseph in the night that says, get up and get out of here. Herod is launching the infanticide. Jesus is at risk. I'm telling you what to do. You do what you have to do to protect him, and do it now. So that there's this sense of urgency that we do whatever we have to do to protect the innocence of our children. Do you remember this? That's the painting that's entitled The Massacre of the Innocents, which is, as you pan back from this and see the whole painting, this is the depiction of Herod's infanticide. And it was up that night to see the expression of this parent, this mom, the anxiety, the angst, the urgency, the desperation, all of the things that are involved in protecting not only the innocent, but the innocence of our children. It's important in order to do that we provide safe space for them to ask questions. These three questions are the ones that Neil Pryor laid out years ago. And I keep bringing them back because I think they're important. They apply to so many situations. He used them for students, but I think this applies for our own children. Do you like me? We have to affirm them. And how you do that depends on you and your child. Am I worth anything? We have to give them a safe place to feel like they are protected in the process with that. Part of that security is knowing who influences them. And that requires investment of time on our part to do that. And then the example of, will I make it? Well, we have to show them how to make it. Not just tell them that they will. We have to show them how to do that. And then we have to give them enough time to grow up in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. We just don't lay this all out there and then they have it the next day. This is a progression that we introduce early on and continue. And if we do that, then we're going to protect their innocence. All right. Then we went to talking about choice. And the text here was the baptism of Jesus. That he made the choice at that point in life. It was time to launch the mission. He did what he needed to do, and it set the course. He chose the road at that point that was going to take him to a place that he would have preferred not to have had to go, We know that from what he tells us later. But it was the choice that he made that changed everything else that happened. If you remember that night, we also talked about making pies. And this time of year, that's probably what you all are doing or have done at Thanksgiving. We'll do again at Christmas. But the metaphor here was that our children are the crust, and we get to pour in the filling. Okay? Now, you remember the recipe for the crust? Well, we'll take you through this. Learning styles was one of them. We have to know how our children learn the best. Do they learn best because they see us do it, or they see what we want them to know? Do they learn it best by hearing it, saying it back, auditory? Do they do better if they write it down or rewrite it or synthesize it in a way that they put it in their own words? Or do they have to touch it? Do they have to manipulate it? All of that. So part of the crust in our children is understanding how they learn. And then another ingredient is the language that they respond best to when you speak. And these are the same ones that you know, words of affirmation, physical touch, receiving gifts, quality time, acts of service. And it can be a combination of those things, but generally there's a predominant one or two in there. So now we have learning style, and now we have love language. Okay, but there's another component to the crust, and I borrowed this from Cynthia Tobias, who is a strong-willed child herself, who has raised strong-willed children. And so these are the things, if you remember these, we talked about them. If you love me and value me, I'll do most anything for you. Now, think in terms of a strong-willed child who's saying this, okay? Most of the time, I'm not trying to annoy you on purpose. I just want you to see me. And I want to know that you love me no matter what. I sometimes need to experience the consequences of not doing what you want me to do in order to experience the motivation for doing it. I respond better to a compelling problem that needs a solution than you just giving me a chore or something to do. I want to be involved in the solution part of it. The action that you take will be more effective than the anger that you show me. The quality of our relationship helps me determine my relationship with God. I think that's the take home there. Need to kind of look at that one. You may need to rescue me even when I insist that I don't need your help. I will never be too old to appreciate hearing what you like about me, and I'm never completely beyond your reach. Sometimes I just need an excuse to take your hand. And then the biggie, never stop loving me. All right, so now we've got learning styles, we've got love language, and we've got the approach to life. This would be one extreme, the real pushback, and then you've got the very passive folks on the other end. So you dump all this in there, you mix it up, and you get the crust. And then you drop in the filling. And the filling actually takes you to this diagram. And that is, you're putting absolutes in the crust of your children that influences their choice. Now, I put this back in because this was a representation of everything that we talked about that night in the way of learning styles. You can look at that, and you can kind of see it and figure it out. You can talk through it. Begins with conception. I have a linear relationship. I expand my community. I have a volume that now allows me to add more awareness of God and Satan, and then I make my choices, and I'm all over the place until my last breath, and then when I have risen, then I go off in one direction or the other into eternity. Now that took maybe 15 seconds, so I could talk it out. I could redraw it and change it up if it made more sense to me in a different kind of configuration. That night I mentioned to you, this looks like Tinker Toys. You could build this with rope and Tinker Toys and manipulate the cube and move it along the timeline and all of that. But the idea is that whenever we have a concept we're trying to teach, we're trying to pour it into this crust. We need to find the way that it's heard and that it can be embraced in the process. And then we have to give them enough time to learn it. So if we intentionally adapt to their learning style, we speak their love language, we channel their wills, help them to find the way to make that productive, and then we give them the absolutes to work with, then we'll begin to influence how they develop their decisions about choices. Okay, that's not a quick fix. That's a big recipe there on all of that. But I think it is important when we're talking about choice. All right, and then we went to recognizing boundaries. And this was the passage that night in the wilderness, where Jesus basically draws on his relationship with his Father and repeats statements in Scripture that push back against the temptations. Part of this was also talking about boundaries, and in our culture, we're leaning toward moving the boundaries to meet our own expectations or desires. Boundary stones have been important really in the history of God's people for a very, very long time. In fact, there are these two warnings, one in Deuteronomy that says, "Cursed is the man who moves his neighbor's boundary stone," and one in Proverbs that says, "Do not move a boundary stone set up by your forefathers, because they mark the identity of families or nations or wherever." So if a boundary stone is in place, you leave it in place. So if we're thinking in terms of absolutes as being boundary stones, our biggest risk comes when either I move a boundary stone or someone else is moving a boundary stone for me and I forget where the original boundary is. That happens because most of the time things are moved inch by inch. Just a little bit, and then we walk away. And then come back a little later, move it a little bit more, and we walk away. And eventually, we don't remember where the original line was. If you remember, this was the sequence of slides that was up there. We have light, dark, good, evil, right, wrong, however you want to use that. And there's a pretty distinct line between those two. And then something happens. It's not much. There's really not much of an encroachment on the white side, but there's a little bit there. And then there's just a little bit more. It doesn't even look like the first one. It's just a little different, but it moved the line, moved the needle just a little bit more. And then it happens again, and then it happens again. And so now the line has moved over into the white square, but it's very, very hard to know where the original line was. So moving boundaries, moving absolutes, has a significant risk. We tried to illustrate this another way, too, to sort of reframe that. And that is to say that boundaries that God created or that we find, and remember we talked about, they begin with verbs, do this, say this, go here, whatever else, all of those. Those are protective. Those are not punitive. That's an important language difference that we need to work into dialogue with children. They're protective. So we're in that, look how much room we've got inside that to move around. But for some reason, the grass is greener, or it seems to be. So we step out, and our protection now is gone. But we don't like it out there. We're so uncomfortable being outside the boundaries because it's a big world out there, and it's dark, and it's all of this chaos going on. So what we would prefer to do is change the boundary. The problem is the new boundary is not protective. It's like a sieve. Okay? And so the idea is we need to recognize the true boundaries and not replace them with the ones that we devise for ourselves. So if we teach our children that God's boundaries are immovable, that they begin with verbs, and that Satan is the one who will do his very best to move the boundary. Remember the red slide at the beginning in order to cut us off? That he will move it. Then I think we will have begun an appropriate discussion about, okay, why are boundaries even something that we need to talk about? Okay? And then we moved on and we talked about legacy. And this was the text with the transfiguration. And two components of this. One was climbing the mountain, just getting up there to be able to be a part of what happened. And the second was the embrace of God on the top, of how that wrapping of the cloud around him in so many ways was a family hug when they got to the top. But to just break this down, do you remember this slide? That legacy is really like a tell that is excavated archaeologically. And it, as you go down through it, you begin to find all these layers. The family legacy is built over time, generation stacked on generation stacked on generation. But if you look at this, it's not perfect. Every layer in here, success, dreams, failures, achievements, vision, interrupts, just goes on where there are good things, where there are bad things, where there were hopes that were fulfilled and dreams that weren't. And then the next generation comes in, and then the next generation. And so this legacy is built, and there is a tendency that if we don't climb all the way to the top, we just sort of check out the layers that are down low, we don't get the big picture. So the idea is that night, you climb the mountain, not the molehill. You don't stop low, because if you do, you don't get the big picture. It's all riddled and looks like it's nothing but failures. So you have to get on up the mountain in order to get the full picture. And then this was go up, grow up part of this, and I thank Brad for this. He sent me the article that linked to this, that the research currently is that our children, in order to mature effectively, need personal experience, not protected exposure. Say that again. Personal experience, not protected exposure. Part of that, again, we talked about prefrontal cortex development, how that part of our thinking, executive function and all doesn't really mature until adulthood, early adulthood. So if we don't have experiences in adolescence that gives us an opportunity to succeed and fail, and we can't learn from that, there's a slow maturation process. So now we get into early adulthood, a generation of folks at that age who have had no personal experience. They've been protected all the way up, and they can't make a decision. They can't decide what's right or wrong. They're confused. So this personal experience, not protected exposure, becomes very important. And then just quickly, climb past the past means we don't want to get stuck in one of those layers. You keep climbing and you see the successes in greater numbers and proportion. Meet me at the top. We lead the way. They come behind. And then once we get there, you remember there's this opportunity to connect with family that is encouraging, that gives us an insight into our past. We learn from the mistakes. We don't want to repeat those. There's a sort of a freeing that we don't have to follow the bad paths that our family has taken. We can see the trails down the mountain that are much more positive and much more productive. And we can repel, we can descend with confidence at that point. So if we help our children understand that legacy is built on layers, that the failures and successes are what teach us what we want to choose, that any of the trails that lead us to the top, to the sun, are going to connect us with God. That, in fact, those of you at Dakota years and years ago may remember that theme, all trails lead to the sun at Dakota, the S-O-N, sun. And the idea was really this. But if we do that, then we begin to teach the value of legacy and how to draw on it in a very, very positive way. All right, share the moment. This was the reunion with the 72 that Jesus sent out. And they were all excited when they came back about all the things that they'd experienced. And the idea with this is when our kids are excited or troubled and they want to talk, that's the moment to talk. Okay, not later, not tomorrow, not whatever. And there are ways to do that that allow us to share the moment that is productive. And these are a couple of the things we said that night. You do it eye to eye. okay? This is not looking at your phone. This is not reading the paper. This is eye to eye. This is the oxytocin bonding time that comes with this. You do it heart to heart, and this is where you just say, I realize this is awkward. It's awkward for you. It's awkward for me. I wish we didn't have to talk about this, but let's just agree it's going to be awkward, and let's just do it. So it's that open transparency to make the connection. And then toe-to-toe, knee-to-knee, which is you lean into it. It's none of this heavy sighing. It's not looking at your watch. It's just, okay, wherever you are is where I want to be. I want to figure this out. I don't know. We've got the answer, but we'll do it. We'll figure it out. It's going to be better than what it is right now. And then maybe this one, most important, ear to mouth, and that is that we don't interrupt. If they're willing to talk, we need to be willing to listen, however long that takes. Sometimes I'm terrible at this if it's late at night. In fact, I'm probably terrible at all of this. If you talk to any of my family, they'll say, I don't know what book he read this out of, but this is not what he lived at home. And I'm probably guilty of that. But I am terrible at night. The later it gets, the less attentive I am. But you just have to kind of find a way to make it work when it needs to work in a certain way. So if our kids are convinced that we're interested, we have to prove that we're interested in what they have to say. And that we'll listen without interrupting them, that we're not going to come down hard on them until they've had an opportunity to say what they need to say, and for us to understand that. And that we're helping, any conversation that we have is designed to help them prepare for what's coming. Then we will have encouraged them to share the moment. And it's not a moment. We want them to share moments, as time goes on. All right, and then we talked about understanding relationships, and this one was from the text of the resurrection of Lazarus, looking at the difference in the relationships between Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Same family, same house, very different personalities, very different relationship that Jesus enjoyed with all three of them. And this was the summary slide. We built this very slowly, but you'll remember this fence that we put up that night. And if you look in the center of it, those are just icons for growing in wisdom, stature, favor with God and man, heart, soul, mind, and strength, basically with this in the center. Whatever is most important in the core of us. And so what we're trying to do is protect that part, or help our children protect that part of themselves in a way that's not cloistered and not interactive, but in a way that is appropriate. Now, if you look at this, the posts are the absolutes. The wire, those are the sharp deterrents that remind us, okay, who needs to be on one side of the fence, who needs to be on the other. And then you see the characteristics of folks on the outside that we really would prefer that our kids not be roaming around inside the fence with. All right? We have the wire, we have the posts, we have the gate. Jesus says, I am the gate. So if people are passing through the gate, then we ought to have some sort of way to measure who's coming on the inside. Okay? And then we talked about relationships are not the same, even inside the fence. You have casual relationships, Then we have cooperative relationships. That's your study group people that you like to be with, and they do their part, and you do your part, and it's a good thing. Then you have committed relationships. These are your better friends. And then sometimes from those you get dating relationships, and then from dating relationships you develop covenant relationships. So again, there's the fence is not a concrete wall. It's just barbed wire. You can see on both sides of the fence. You can have conversations over the fence. You're not eliminating interacting with people. You're just helping decide who should be close and who shouldn't. So this is sort of a long metaphor here to figure out a way to help our children understand that all relationships are not the same. And then here's the take home that night. Really, it's protective. That's what building that fence is all about. All right, and then we talked about cultivating contentment. And this was in Gethsemane, the resolution on Jesus' part to say, this isn't the way I wish it would go, but because that's what needs to happen, that's your will, then I am okay with that. I will follow through on what needs to happen. This is that climb. Again, a lot of climbing going on in here. But we don't get to contentment just by saying, I'll be content. You know, we have to be aware of the choice to be content. And we have to angst about it. Sometimes we come to acceptance, still not particularly pleasant. We ask for assistance from God himself and for those who can encourage us. And then we're resolved to do that. It is a learned experience. So just telling our kids to be quiet and be content doesn't work. You have to work through the process to get there. If you ever use the Serenity Prayer as an example of contentment, please do not use the one on the left. Please use the complete prayer that's on the right, which really talks about what it takes to reach what's on the left. And basically, this is the same as this from Proverbs, which is just enough. I don't need too much, because if I have too much, then I feel like it's all my doing. And I don't need too little, because if I have too little, then I want what you have. Just give me enough. And so if we can teach that, then peace, contentment for our children, it depends on trusting God rather than circumstances. We're not reacting. We're just trusting that it'll be okay. It's learned from sharing. That's probably one of the best ways to teach contentment. And if we can get to the point where we're okay with enough is enough, then we will have cultivated this. All right. Next is experience forgiveness. These are more recent, so we'll just hurry on through these since you've seen these recently. I thought the most important thing this night were these slides. Forgiveness is and forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is a deliberate decision. It is determination to let go of resentment. It is independent of whether the offender, whether it's deserved or not. It's accepting that the offenses have a past, they have a present, and they have a future. So when we're talking about trying to talk about forgiveness, this is important. And this is what it's not. And you can read that for yourself, but down at the bottom, it is not an obligation to reconcile, although that's the hope. It may not happen, and it is not an immediate restoration of trust. Okay, so forgiveness is separated in that. This was a rearrangement of Scripture, and I'm hoping that this is not something terribly off, but by putting this in this order, and I just flipped 14 above 12 and 13, is the sequence that it's easier to teach forgiveness. That you teach love first, and then you teach the virtues that are positive, and then when you teach forgiveness, you teach it from a third-person perspective. This is what forgiveness looks like. When people are unkind to you, they're not always kind. When people say horrible things, that sort of thing, then this is what we do. And we do that because we're forgiven in that way. So we teach it as if this is what it looks like. You can see it as a third person before you step into it, because it has to be a desired decision. Okay? I think it's important also that we teach that it is that forgiveness comes from a position of strength and not from weakness. That if I choose to forgive, it's because I've worked all the rest of this out. And it's not because I'm beat down and I've been made to feel like I have to or whatever else. That I've come to terms with it. And that's a position of strength because it does not depend on the response of the person to whom I'm offering that forgiveness. Okay? So here is, if we teach that God wants us to experience the blessing of being forgiven, that we understand that His forgiveness is directly proportionate to how we forgive, and that we learn that forgiveness is always healing for the one who forgives, then we're beginning to experience what forgiveness is all about. All right, and then we got to trust, and this text is from the cross. Into your hands I commit my spirit. Okay, and the whole idea here was separating the idea of faith and trust. Faith is, if I'm going to be involved in a trust fall, okay, I have faith that you'll catch me, but I don't have trust until I let go. Okay, so I can talk a good faith story, but I have to demonstrate trust. Okay, we have to teach our kids to be trustworthy. And this was up there because if they are trustworthy, they know what trustworthiness looks like. And so a lot of times we say, it takes one to know one in a kind of a snarky way, but this is in a more positive way to say that if we're teaching trust, then they know what it looks like, where the risk comes from. The things in a relationship that you want to look at before you become in a trusted relationship is just a casual connection to begin with. And we talked about that's the mission statement for the College Church right now. You connect in all directions. So it has to start somewhere. Then you progress with caution. You just get to know folks a little bit before you really launch into a relationship that you may or may not be able to trust. You look for things that make it consistent. Do they show up when they say they're going to show up? Do they do what they say? Are they honest? You can begin to measure that. At some point, it takes a leap of faith, a step of courage, to step out and hook your carabiner on in that relationship. But remember, the carabiner has a quick release. So if you find that relationship's gone south, you disconnect. All right? And then you go back to caution, and you work back through that again. And then commitment, of course, is the last step in all of that. That was put up here because of this. And just as a reminder, on the internet, it only takes 8 days for our children to be in a situation, groomed would be the term here, to begin to share information or to meet someone online. And this is Jennifer Barnes Moffat's book that talks about this. It is fiction, it's very dark, but if you're interested in sort of seeing how this all works, that is one place to look. And so demonstrating trust really is all built around that difference in faith, saying it, and trust, doing it. And then last week, just very quickly, we talked about finishing strong, and the text there is the ascension. Jesus has done everything that needed to be done, and he leaves basically saying, all right, now let's get on with it. And the angels, the messengers of God in that relationship come back and say, what are you waiting around for? You know what you're supposed to do. Let's get on with what's happening. I put this back up because this was my favorite slide last week. This is Joseph Akwari from Tanzania, who fell in the Mexico Olympics, was banged up badly, got all cleaned up, got back on the track. The winner finished an hour before him. He crossed the finish line an hour later, and this was when he was asked, why'd you do it? He said, my country did not send me 5,000 miles to start the race. They sent me to finish it. And I think that's the piece that we just have to live. We have to say over again, quickly maintain speed for the long run. We talked about all this last week. Stay on course, stay hydrated. Keep it simple. Whatever we're saying, whatever the advice is, keep it simple and say it often. And you guys came up with things last week that were things that you remember because they were so succinct, they were so pithy. And then this is if we teach them to dream dreams of the finish line, to run the course with someone who knows it, which means look at the coxswain and the crewing team. They're rowing with their back to the finish line. He's the one who can see it. So if our eyes are on Jesus, he's the one who's giving us the commands on how to get there. And then we'll have taught them how to finish well. So in the last few minutes here, where do we begin to deal with all the chaos of this culture? All this sounds great, but where do you start? What do you do? If you have a chance to go to American Studies coming up in January, this is Admiral McRaven's book, Make Your Bed. He's a phenomenal retired career person in Arms Navy SEAL. And he gave this commencement address at the University of Texas. And it's about 10 things in there that make a difference. But the first one is make your bed. And you do it every morning. And it's an achievement you accomplished, even if you don't get anything else done during the day. And you do it right. He talks about basic training where the officers come in and they can't bounce a quarter off of it, or the corners aren't tucked, or whatever else. Well, you have to do it again, and you pay the price for doing that. But it's a great read. It's a short read, real quick read. I suspect that his presentation will be excellent as well. But make the bed, and I'm saying that, just start somewhere with something little. Keep it simple, say it often, and then you build on that as we go along. I wanted to show you this. The world is dark out there. It has been. If you need a Christmas present for someone in your family, I would encourage this. This is a SteriPen. You can take it with it wherever you go. If you're at a place where you can't drink the water, it has a light on it. You put it down in the Nalgene bottle, turn it on. 30 seconds later, it disinfects all the trash that's in the water, so it's drinkable, at that point. But the metaphor here is Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And we can believe that he was. But then, look what he says in the Sermon on the Mount. You are the light of the world. He's the light, he teaches us. We're the light, we teach our kids. And so, for the last time, I promise, this is the last time you will see this. I think if we're going to teach well, we see the one, Jesus himself, the Father-Son relationship. We do what they did, and then we teach it to our kids, who then repeat the cycle. See the one, do the one, teach the one. Some of you will remember Carol Burnett. At the end of her show, she used to always sing this. I'm so glad we've had this time together just to laugh or sing a song. Seems we just get started, before you know it, comes the time to say so long. And that's where we are tonight. So many thanks to Danny Wood for reading, for Nick McNabb, who kept us on the air, even through fire alarms and all kinds of stuff that went on, for Nathan and your crew, Andy and Daniel, for Simple Supper, and really for all of you, and for those of you online who've been great to send comments and be a part of this whole thing. If you have anything that you feel like we've missed or we need to add into this whole presentation, send me a note. It is on Facebook. You can find it there. There are links to YouTube. Every one of these has been uploaded, and Nick's going to put a link on there where if you need to find them or go back, that's fine. Next week, Noah will have will take over this class. The 5:30 class on campus is moving in here, and so I hope you'll come back and be a part of that as well. I can't tell you how much this has been a pleasure, and I hope you guys all have a very, very great holiday season. So see you.